Have you ever wondered how some developers are able to build things so incredibly fast? How they're able to spin up APIs, databases, compute, anything they need with just a few lines of code? Hi everyone, my name is Flynn. I've been working as a prototype developer inside Amazon at AWS for the last 7 years. I've been building prototypes for some of the largest customers in the world. I've learned from some of the best people in the business about how to build products quickly and how to showcase their value to the business. In this series, I want to showcase a bit about how the AWS CDK, which is the Cloud Development Kit, works and how you can use it to create your own prototypes and get things up and running as fast as possible. So here we are in a blank terminal. I've not actually set up anything yet. We're going to go through this step by step. I want to show you guys how the CDK works and why it's so powerful. So all we have to do is basically just make sure we have Node installed. So here I have Node 20. Of course, you can use whatever node you like, I think, as long as it's newer than 18. So from here, what you'll want to do is you'll want to npm install the AWS CDK, and you'll install that with a G tag on the end, just to make sure it's global and it's available everywhere on your computer. Keeps things simple. So what you can do from here is actually just CDK init, and you can actually choose a specific language in which you want to create your CDK application. Now, really what CDK is at the heart of things is a way for you to define infrastructure as code that allows you to sort of spin up resources in AWS in a really, really quick way. So what we want to do here is you want to go with TypeScript. I know you might be saying, oh no, I hate TypeScript, or I want to use Go, or I want to use Python or Java. Trust me, on this one, you just want to use TypeScript. It is the default. It's what this whole platform is built around. All the documentation is going to be better in TypeScript. You get inbuilt IntelliSense in the editor. It's just a better option in general. So that's done now. So what we actually want to make sure we do here is we want to have some valid AWS credentials that we can actually use to deploy our infrastructure. That's the main thing. So make sure you've got some AWS credentials set up. You can use the AWS configure, which will actually prompt you to put in your access key and your secret key. I already have mine in, so we're not gonna need to do that here. But I highly recommend using that command to add in your access key and your secret key, and then at that point, the CDK will utilize those to deploy the infrastructure. So now that we've done that, let's crack open VS Code. So I'm just gonna do a code dot here, which will open up VS Code in the current working directory, and let's make that a bit larger. So what we actually have here is we have a folder called lib, and we have a folder called bin. So these two here are the important files that we're going to start with. Now, if you have a look at bin is kind of like the entry point, just like you would imagine. Typically, you create a binary and it would be stored in bin, for example. In this case, it's just going to be the entry point of our application. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to remove all these comments here. We actually don't want those comments. Just going to keep it nice and simple for now. And what we're going to do is we're going to rename our stack. I'm going to call it Backend Stack. Let's go with something like that, nice and simple, that tells us exactly what it is that this is going to be used for. We're going to be deploying the backend of our new application via the backend stack, right? Makes sense. What I'm also going to do is I'm just going to quickly rename this to main so that it's just a very simple way to understand that this is the main thing that's going to be running, and we don't have to worry with too much else there. The only other thing that we have to change in that case is just over in cdk.json, we're just going to change this to main.ts, which is going to be the entry point of our application. Nice and simple, just fixing up a couple of naming standards to keep things in line. So next thing here, we can see that we have this one CDK stack, which was the name of our folder, right? So of course, when I created a CDK application a minute ago, it utilized the folder name there to do some guessing about what we might want to call things. Let's go down here and actually just call this our backend stack. So this is actually going to be our backend stack down here. That's going to hold all of our resources. So let's go ahead and call this our backend stack. And we can just remove this comment here, and it's nice and clean. There's nothing else in here. It's just the instantiation of our backend stack. Let's go over here and again, import our backend stack into our main. So there we go. We have essentially a new instance of a backend stack, which deploys nothing. There's nothing in there at all. You can see we're calling an instance of new backend stack right there, and that's going to take this here and launch this as infrastructure as code in AWS via the CloudFormation service. Now, there's no infrastructure in here at all, so this is going to do absolutely nothing right now. But we have this template, we have this structure now in place where we can simply start adding in resources that we want for our application. So typically what I'd do in this case is I'd say like, okay, we are going to need, what do we need? If we're going to build a standard application to showcase how CDK works and how you could utilize it, we're going to need a database, we're going to need an API, And we're going to need some way to interact with that database via the API, some compute layer that we want to sort of proxy through to talk to our database. So this is a great way to just start learning CDK by creating a very simple application like this. So what I like to do is I always like to comment in here about the things we're going to need before we actually do it. And that also helps Copilot understand what we're doing as well, so it has more context and can help us out where needed. So we're going to need a DynamoDB table here with an ID primary key. Right, so we're going to need some way in which we can store some data in a table, and then we're also going to want to interact with that data, so we have to have a primary key to look things up. We are going to want a API gateway, and it should have a get method also. So you can see IntelliSense also jumping into action there, helping understand what you might want. We also want a Lambda function that can be called by the API gateway to the Dynamo table, so this is also what we want. And that basically is all we need. Right now we have a database, we have an API, and we have a compute layer that we can run some code on that will be able to interact with our DynamoDB table. So this is something that might take days or weeks for people to set up traditionally, but it's incredibly simple to set up, and I want to showcase that a little bit more here. So now let's go ahead and add these in. So what we're going to do is we're going to say our const table, we're going to say table, and IntelliSense will really help us here. You'll notice that it'll say CDK AWS table, right? So this is basically the class comes from the DynamoDB resource here. That's part of this CDK lib up the top. So you can see we're importing that. And that contains all of the different resources from the different services that we need to create those individually. So it contains everything from Dynamo table to Lambda to API gateway, all part of that one library. So we can utilize that. And you'll see here as well, we want to create a Dynamo table with a partition key. That partition key is going to be called ID. We're going to basically store values with the ID on there. And typically what we want to add here as well is we want to set up the billing mode so that it's like pay per request. With DynamoDB, you have two options. You can essentially have provisioned throughput, where it essentially assigns a certain amount of write and read capacity to the table. But if you're not using it that frequently, you might just want to go with pay per request, right? It allows you to just kind of scale down to 0, which is one of the great things about serverless in AWS. So there's a bunch of other properties here on the table that you can add. We don't really need to add them. There's all sorts of really, really nice features like streaming out of the table. We can have point-in-time recoveries, backups, all sorts of really nice things there, including encryption as well. All of that's managed out of the box and accessible, but let's just skip that for now because that doesn't really help us understand CDK and what we can do here. So here we have the table set up, like I just said before. Now let's create our API gateway. So let's say const API gateway, and we'll let it kick into action here as well. You can see it's creating our REST API for us. Now a REST API is one of the options, but what we can actually do here is create a HTTP API, which is what we're going to go here. And we're also going to use a little bit of a different construct here. We're going to use the API gateway v2, and we're going to use HTTP API. So there's two differences here, and it's probably not worth going into too much detail in this, but HTTP API is typically one if you're just going to be creating an API to interact with your front end of your application. We don't need a full REST API with advanced parameters right now. We'll go with something simple, which is a HTTP API. So a couple of things here. There's things like API name, cause options, those sorts of things, description, everything else. What we might do for this is we'll put in the default for the cause stuff so that we can interact with it. We're just going to allow origin star on anything, and we'll allow for a post and also a get request on there as well. That's pretty much all we need to start off with. We don't really need to give it a name as well. Typically in AWS, a lot of the resources that you end up creating don't really need a specific static name. You'll use DNS to sort of route where you need to, typically for most things anyway. So that's our API gateway, and now let's go ahead and make our handler function. So the handler function is going to be the thing that receives the calls via the API gateway, and then it can store things in Dynamo, it can interact with other services. It's basically the thing that's able to proxy the request coming from the outside world, do the thing it needs to do, and then return the response to the user. So let's say we could create a Node.js function like this. That's one simple way to do it. And then just like that, you can plug in the runtime version of Node that you want. And you can preference the environment variables here as well by passing those in down into the handler so that they're available, so it knows what table to write to and what to do with that sort of thing. So this is a very simple way to create a function here, and you can see that we're pointing it to something called handler TS. So let's just fix up this here. This is actually going to be from the AWS Lambda Node.js package, and then we're going to have Node.js function like that, right? So this is going to be our handler function. Here it is pointing to source handler TS, which doesn't exist yet, but we're going to create that in a second and you'll see how easy that is. So when it actually comes in here, let's give it a different name. Let's call it main TS, right? Because the function that it calls inside main, we're going to call handler. And if we called it handler, it'd be handler, 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 handler. Gets confusing. So let's just call it main, which calls handler. So here you can see on the second line, that's just basically which function should I run when I actually have to execute the code, right? So when API Gateway says, hey, I've got this request coming through, what file should I run, right? Which Lambda should I run? And this is going to be, of course, our main TS. And then what is the actual main function that I should execute with the payload that comes from API Gateway? That's going to be the handler function that we'll define in a moment. Which version of Node should it run? It's just going to say Node.js 20, for example. Here we can plug in all sorts of things like environment variables. We can do way more stuff here as well. But this is actually quite streamlined. You don't really need to give it much else to get started. And this is the whole point of utilizing CDK for rapid prototyping and building up your next application because it's so simple. So one of the really, really awesome parts about CDK as well is that, you have this idea where certain things need to talk to each other, right? Like for this code, for example, that we're going to put in main TS, it needs to be able to interact with the database, with this table that we've created in DynamoDB. But at the moment, like we all know that permission boundaries are very strict by default. And if you want to allow access to things, you've got to create IAM rules, and those have policies, and you have statements there that you have to say what's allowed and what's not allowed. So in this case, it's really simple in CDK. All we really need to do is we just say that we go to the table, so table.grant read write access, and what you're doing right there with a single line is granting that Lambda function access to read and write from that Dynamo table. Right? It's as simple as that. And so here we have basically in a handful of lines of code, we have a fully functional API, a table, and a skeleton of a function that will interact with our database. So it's just that easy to get started with CDK. So in the next clip, we're going to actually deploy this. We're going to create our main TS, and we're actually going to start interacting by storing some data in the table and showcasing a bit more about how easy that is. So stick around and join me for the next one.